The other mode on the bottom next to Animator is Articulation View, and this allows us to do some velocity switching between two articulations. Now, in the main velocity range, until we hit the crossover point that we set with this slider here, we have a choice of vibrato or non-vibrato sound, and those are pretty self-explanatory. When the sound is held, we'll hear vibrato. And once we cross over the user-defined threshold here, we can trigger an alternate articulation. Now, in this performance version of Session Horns Pro, we can only trigger two articulations at a time, and when you're in Animator mode, the articulations aren't even involved. But when we're in regular playback mode, we can trigger two, and we can trigger additional articulations when we're working with key switches, and we'll look at that separately. But for now, we can switch between two articulations. We choose the second one here from this drop-down menu, and we have a variety of choices. And this, as I say, is the crossover point for what velocity it will be triggered at. So it's useful to become familiar with the qualities of the sounds of the different articulations, and that way you'll be able to make more informed choices in your brass arrangements. So what I want to do in this video is go through them and give you little examples of what they each sound like. Now, the first one, when we trigger past the crossover velocity, is what's called a rip. And this is kind of a glide at the beginning of a long sustained note, and woodwinds and brass use this. It's a kind of variation of a glissando, so you hear a big kind of, well, glissando, kind of quick glissando up at the beginning of a long note. So let's listen to this little example, and because I'm in Smart Voice Split here, and this operates in a kind of polyphonic legato mode, I can have sustained chords happening here, and then have a second line going on top, and the velocities in these notes will trigger the alternate articulations, and the velocities in these ones won't if they're under the threshold. So once one is triggered, it doesn't mean all of them are triggered. So let's listen to this, and this is all the same brass instrument, and we're going to hear the rips on the louder velocity notes on top here. So that's the sound of a rip, and again, if I play these soloed, I want to really point this out because it's a great feature in Session Horns Pro, this polyphonic legato, where the velocity switching applies to only the notes that are crossing the threshold. So really nice way to get some realism with the velocities. Now the next example is a grace note, and this is kind of a very quick continuous change very briefly between a note right below or right before the main note. And it's usually a whole tone below, but it's just a quick little hint of the note a tone below before the main note hits. So let's listen to this example. It's the same chord pattern. We have the sustained chords, a little melodic line, and the notes that are at the louder velocities will trigger this grace note. So you can really hear that little sort of quick scoop up. It's almost like a really subtle portamento, quick little scoop up. Very realistic thing that brass players do. Next is a grace note with vibrato, and this is the same thing, but the longer notes will add a vibrato to it. So here's another example. So nice if you're using long notes with grace notes to add vibrato. Now we get into the forte piano crescendo, and this is the default articulation switch that you get when you open up, and I've been using this for most of the videos. And basically there's two versions. There's a 2-beat and a 4-beat version. It's a short forte piano crescendo, and that's an Italian dynamic term, and it means that it starts with a loud attack and that gets quiet very quickly and then increases in volume. So sudden attack, quick drop down, and then a swell up. Now what makes this special is that it lasts 2 beats, or this version lasts 4 beats, and you can control how long it's going to swell. Now one really nice little feature with Session Horns Pro is that you can force this to conform to the tempo. Right now, as it is, the 2 beats is based on a tempo of 120 beats per minute. And this example is at a slower tempo than that. So you'll hear that these swells don't last a full 2 beats. Let me play it for you. Now, if we go into control mode here, we have time stretching, and when we switch that on, it'll automatically stretch or compress the swells here so that they do last exactly 2 beats. So you can hear there a full 2 beats. Let's just listen to the first note, A, B it with the time stretching on and off. So here it is with it on. And now when we listen to it with it off, it's shorter because this is a slower tempo than 120. Now here's another example with the 4 beats, and here I have the whole part doing it. So let's listen first with time stretching off, and it won't last the full 4 beats. Let's switch the articulation. We're still at 2. Here we go, 4 beats. Let's try that again. And with time stretching on, we'll get the full 4 beats now. Let's try that again. So really nice to have it fit your tempo like that. Again, it adds a little nuance of realism that most other sample playback instruments don't have. Let's go back to our main view and we'll look at the next articulation, which is a growl. And this is kind of a guttural, gritty timbre where brass players get a kind of growl-like sound in their tone. And we can hear it in this version here with, again, some sustained chords at lower velocities here, and then some melodic notes, some of which are above the threshold and will trigger the growl. So the last note was at a quieter velocity and sustains regularly. And again, here the polyphonic legato really adds a nice kind of powerful feature to how we can use this instrument. So really nice to have that programmed into the algorithms here. Now we have a variety of marcato and staccato sounds. So we have growl vibrato. It's the same thing with a vibrato added on. Let's just listen to that again. Again, more useful for longer notes, but we have the option with or without vibrato. Now, a marcato is another Italian dynamic marking, and it's an accentuated note or chord, depending how many notes you're triggering, but it's got a kind of sharp attack, and then it decays fairly quickly. And we have a long marcato and short marcato. And I'm going to play this same example with all the marcato and staccato variations, and you'll hear the effect on the durations that these dynamic articulation switches have. So this is marcato long, where there's a not too quick decay on the tone. So that's the top line, obviously, that has those marcatos. And this is great when you're doing parts that require notes that aren't sustained that long, because brass players release their notes differently when they're playing shorter notes rather than long notes. Now let's have marcato medium, and you'll hear that they won't last as long. They'll decay quicker. And again, the polyphonic legato here is great because we have these sustaining without the marcato effect. Then we get into staccato, which have even shorter decays. And again, this is an Italian dynamic marking. And it's an articulation technique that has, again, an accented start for each note. And then it is very sort of detached. So sometimes if you have a bunch of rapid short notes, they're marked with staccato markings. And they're sort of detached from each other. But let's listen to this example, and you'll hear that they're shorter. So when you have those those succession of short notes, it's a way of playing them in a non-detached, or rather a non-attached manner. Then we have staccatissimo, which is even shorter, so it's really severely truncated. And listen again in these 3/8 notes in those little groupings. So very detached types of articulations. Now we get into trills, and these are interesting, and these are for sax only. They're semitone and full tone trills. And here again I have one brass part, but we'll hear that the notes that trigger the velocity switch will perform a trill on a saxophone. And a trill is like a really rapid alteration between two adjacent notes, and in this case it's going to be a semitone. And then we have another version with a whole tone trill, which is the same thing, but it's a rapid alteration with a note a whole tone away rather than half tone. And related to this, we have a brass shake, and this is for brass sounds only, so not saxophones, but trumpets and trombones. And it's the same kind of thing. It's like a coarse trill that's played on trumpet or trombones. So it's a brass version of a trill, but we call it a shake. Now there's one other articulation that's available always, regardless of these articulation settings here, and that is the doit. And you can see that on the control page over here. We get, with the pitch wheel, we get a doit, which is a kind of a quick fall or rise on a note. And when we move the pitch wheel down, we'll get it going down. And when we move it up, we'll get it ascending, going up. And here we can get it on release of the note only if we want, or with the note. So here's a little phrase, and you can see the pitch bend markings in here, and you'll hear, here's one to start with, and we're going to hear it going down there, and then we're going to hear it going up there, and up again there. And it's important that the pitch bend event falls slightly before the note. And there we had that with the brass shake. So that was another articulation that was available in this particular example because I had the velocity switcher set to shake. So that works nicely. Let's hear what it sounds like with those doits on the release rather than on the note on. Let me switch this, just so we're not going to get distracted with the shake. I'll switch this to grace note. It's not really programmed appropriately to take advantage of the releases. You need more space between the notes that come after, but that's the way it is. And let's listen again with it on, just to refresh our memory here. Now we're going to hear it with the grace note articulation. So that's great. You really hear the grace notes on this particular grouping of notes over there. So that's a little sort of taste of all the various playing and performance articulations that are available. And in the next videos, we're going to look at how to trigger them using the key switch version of Session Horns Pro.